Um, just a couple of Gemaras that talk about Shadim. Amar Rav Aivu bar Nagri, Amar Rav Yichia bar Abba, V'latehem, good morning, Elu ma'aseh Shadim, that the Gemara says that the Chartumim of Paro actually used Shadim, because when the Torah says they use Latehem, they use their incantations, there are two words. One is Bilatehem, and the other one is Bilahatehem. So Latehem means Elu Maaseh Shadim, and Bilahatehem, Elu Maaseh Kshafim. That's magic. V'chein omer ve'eit lahat hacherev hamitapechet. And when the Torah says that God placed the spinning sword in front of the entrance of the Garden of Eden, Amar Abaye, the kapid amana shade, the low kapid amana kshafim. So what does that mean? So Rashi explains the kapid amana misha makpid al hakli she'eno yachol la'asot davar below kli haroi la'oto davar kagon sarei bohan shetzrichim sakin shekito shachor v'sarei kos shetzrichin kos shel zchuchit. He says any kind of magician or sorcerer or witch that uses a utensil, it's because that utensil, they're utilizing the power of shadim. And the low kapid amanak shafim, if a person can perform magic without using a utensil, so then he's using a power called kishuf. In other words, there's different energies that you can tap into. You can tap into the shadim force, or you can tap into the black magic force. They're two different things. Okay, we're gonna go on. There's an important shuva from the Radbaz on shadim. Okay, so let me bring up the bio of the Radbaz. Just 1 second. Whoops, I did something here. Okay. All right. So Rabbi David ibn Zimra, called the Radbaz, he's born in 1479, he dies in 1573. So he's 16th century. And yeah. He says, She'elah, Yilamadenu Rabbeinu, al inyan ha-she'elah b'shedim, eze derech mutar, ve'eze derech asur. He says, please teach us, Rabbi, what is permissible to do with shadim, what may not be done with shadim. Ki gam rabim partzu gidra shel Torah, u'mekatrim la shadim. There are a lot of people who offer different kinds of offerings or incantations to the demons. Va'omrim she'en kavanatam lo'avdam, adarabba lachuf otam lahachricham la'asot ritzonam. And they say that they're not worshiping the demons, they're just trying to control them to have their will done. Im yesh bazet sad heter. Is there any permissibility to utilizing demons? Ki shamati ki katro l'shed b'fnei echad migdolei hador v'lo micha biyadam. Because I heard of one Jew who did some kind of incantational exercise to a shade in front of one of the Gedolei Hador, one of the great leaders of the generation, and he did not protest. So what is your opinion about this whole thing? Shuva, ani lo a'amin shenase davar kazeh b'fnei talmid chacham v'shatak. I refuse to believe that a Jew would do some kind of demonic service in front of a great rabbi, and the rabbi would be silent. Ki hamikater la shedim lechabram ulekavtzam chayev mita umitatu biskila im hayu sham edim v'hasra. He says, because anyone who incants or services a shade in order to gather them together and get them to do his bidding, is chayiv misa. He's liable for the death penalty because he's committed a biblical offense for which the penalty is death. Ditnan beperk dalid misos based in val ov ze pitom hamedaber mishichyo b'idoni hamedaber b'fiv harei elu biskila v'hanishal b'hen ba'azhara. He says that a person who's a Baal Ov, which the Torah says you may not worship Ov and Yidoni, Ze Pitom, Amidaber Mishichyo. So this is a certain kind of which was actually, this is, the Gemara actually says this whole thing on top, that is that he has some kind of apparatus underneath his armpit in order to summon some kind of force. And the Yidoni Hamedaber Befiv, the Yidoni Hamedaber Befiv, and Yidoni is where he places, I believe, a bone in his mouth, and he has some kind of magic force speak from his mouth. I think that's the way Rashi learns. Rashi says, "Kin mefarish begemara, chaya echad yesh shema yadua." There's a certain well-known animal of the wild. Umachnis mimena etzem letoch piv v'ha'etzem medaber me'ela v'yedek shafim. And the bone of this animal, you stick it either in your armpit or in your mouth, and it starts to speak on its own. Okay. Harei elu biskila, and the hanishal bahem ba'azhara, and anyone who sort of asks a question of them, even though he doesn't do the practice itself, is violating a biblical commandment. Uparach begemara ma'ishna hachat dekatani bal ov b'yidani, u'ma'ishna gabi krisus dekatani bal ov b'shari liyidoni. Why is it in one place in the Torah that ov and yidoni are mentioned together? And where it talks about getting kares, it only mentions ov and it leaves out yidoni. Masik Allah debal ov de katani b'krisus b'makatr l'shed demodu be'rabanan. Pirish Rashi zal shemakatr lifnei hashed hamamun al osa davar dahavi ma'isa gomer. He says because ov is worse than yidoni because you're actually offering some kind of offering to a shade, to a demon. Uparach amar le rava makatr l'shedim oved avodah zarahu. So Rava says, 1 second, that can't be the definition of ov, because a person who offers anything to a shade is committing full-blown idolatry. And idolatry is already mentioned in the Torah. And Ela Amar Rava b'makato l'chaber, pirush eno makato l'shem Elohus el yedei haktorah, nase hakishuf l'chaber hashedim l'kan. And then Rava concludes that ov is where you're not worshiping them, but rather you're offering some kind of incense or incantation in order to gather them together to do your bidding. Amar le Abaye b'makato l'chaber chover chaverhu, pirush ve'eno ela b'lav. And then to that Abaye says, no, that's only a negative commandment. You don't get death for that. Umeshani ein haTorah amra chover ze b'skila, pirush Rashi zal me'achar shemechaber es hashed b'mezid amar Torah shehi b'skila, so umeshani in haTorah amra chover ze b'skila. And Abaye says the word chover chaver is synonymous with ov, and anyone who does that gets skila. Arei lecha mefurash min hasugya shamakatu l'shedim l'chabrim l'kavtzim l'kaf asam sheyasu bakashaso arehu bichlal bal ov umisasu b'skila. You see from here that anyone who worships demons, even not for the sake of worship, but just for the sake of rousing them and getting them to do your bidding, you get the death penalty. I'm going to skip a little bit. Halamadata, go to the underlined section. Sheyesh gimel midei ketores lekabetz sashedim ulachupam chayev misa. So you see from all of this discussion that there are 3 different ways that you can offer, make an offering to the shadim in order to gather them together. And in all of those cases, you're liable for the death penalty. Lahavricham o liktor et habayit stam o hanoshim hamakatru tetahechel potter. Aval asur lahaktu lahavir reach ra o lahavir ifu shaver bizman hadavar harezem bizman hadever harezem mutar. So, in order to chase away demons, or to charm the house, or so in all of those situations, you're going to be potter. If your intention is not to gather demons, but rather just to chase them out, that's potter of al asr. But you're not allowed to do that, but you don't get punished for that. And if you're just deodorizing the house by offering incense, so then that's mutar. I actually had a woman who was collecting tzedakah that just recently came to my door. And she said, "Here, I want you to take this." She wanted to show me that she was willing to give me something for my donation. So she says, "Here is an Israeli woman." So she says, "Here's sage." She gives me dried sage, and she says, "You need to every Erev Shabbat." This is what the Sephardim do. They burn sage and they wave it throughout the house. It gives the house this smoky fragrance. And she says this will drive away all of the bad mazal, all of the bad spirit. So there are a lot of Jews who even today believe it. But apparently the Radbaz says you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to drive away evil forces even today by doing these kinds of superstitious practices. What about if you're not offering anything to them, like this incense? Yesh machlokes beposkim. There's a machlokes. Shaharama kasav the ma'isa shedim ari b'chlol ma'isa keshafim v'chein katz v'psas meha poskim. That any manipulation that you do in order to draw shedim is a Torah prohibition, and some poskim agree with that. And the Rush says that it's not, and he says that and the Gemara, he quotes the Gemara that we started with, V'amar Abaye Hilchos Kshafim ki Hilchos Shabbos, that the laws of magic or the occult are similar to the laws of Shabbos in that there are different levels. Yesh mehem beskila, yesh mehem potter of al aser, yesh mehem muter lechatchila. That some of them are liable for the death penalty, some of them are aser, but if you do them, you don't get any penalty, and some of them are completely permissible. Ha'osa ma'isa beskila ha'oches esoinayim potter of al aser. So if you do an actual magic trick, like in other words, you summon the occult, so then you get the death penalty. If you perform an illusion, like you're one of our magicians today, that you're not allowed to do. And that's a whole question. How are people allowed to do magic shows? So there's a whole question, and the poskim generally say that since today everybody recognizes that it's not real magic, so then it's not a problem. What's muter lechatchila? K'd Rab Chanina of Rav Hoshia davu aski kol ma'liyom edushabta the Sefer Yetzira v'ivru lahu egla tulisa v'achlila. That what's completely permitted, Rav Chanina and Rav Hoshia would every Erev Shabbos, bless you, they would engage in something called the Sefer Yetzira, which is a book on how God created the world. We have copies of Sefer Yetzira today. People have access to it. I have 2 copies in my house of Sefer Yetzira. It's very cryptic. It's very difficult to understand what it's all about. But the fact is that they used that book to create every Erev Shabbos a fatted calf that they would shecht, and then they would have food for Shabbos. And they created it using these incantations from Sefer Yetzira. Because of Harosh Zal, Yera'a Kevin de Rebchia bar Abba ve'Abaya Pirshu Lanu, Mahe Maisa Shedim, Mahe Maisa Kshafim, Shadaitam, Maskemes Shemaisa Shedim, Eno Bichlal Kshafim, Umutarim Heim, the Heim Bichlal Ufta, the Rav Chanin of Rav Hoshia. He says they used some kind of demonic force to allow them to create this calf. The Imaisa Shedim Asr Kamase Kshafim, Mainafkamina B'Masha Pirshu, Mahe Maisa Shedim, Mahe Maisa Kshafim Adkan. So the Rush seems to be suggesting that you're allowed to harness the power of Shadim, and there's a permissible way to do this. And that's what Reb Chia Bar Abba and Rav Hoshia were doing. And the Radvaz is very surprised at this interpretation. He says, "Vani shamati v'lo ovin kavanaso, de'chiala ladas de'gavri raver v'kihani havu aski kol mali yom v'deshabta b'maisa shedim v'hayunenim v'ochlim hadover hanasa al yedei shedim." I can't understand, how could the Rush even suggest that two great rabbis of the Gemara would harness demons in order to create an animal that they could eat? They would do this every Friday. Besud de Sefer Yitzira hayu asukim, uvein shi hayihi peir Sefer Yitzira hanimsa etzlenu, shuhu miyuchas le'Avraham Avinu. He says, and furthermore, the Gemara over there says that these two rabbis were engaged in the Sefer Yitzira, the book of creation. And whether that's the book of creation that we have, that is attributed to, in its authorship to Avraham Avinu, okay, Perish Rashi zal shahayu mitzarfim osios Hashem shebehem nivra ha'olam, or like Rashi explains, that what does it mean they utilize the Sefer Yetzirah? The Sefer Yetzirah contains different permutations of letters to show you how God created the world with the letters of the alphabet. And so maybe they did the same thing. They took different letters and used them in incantational ways by combining different permutations of letters, and that's how they created stuff. And what Rashi says is that this was not forbidden occultish practice because they were just imitating the way God created the world. So what you see from here, says the Radbaz, is that there was no demons that were channeled in creating these animals. So we're going to skip a little bit further. Umikan yesh lilmod, but he says from all of this, yesh delishol b'shedim al yedei hashvoas shemos hakodesh muter. Mali lahashbia shedim umali lahashbia hamalach. He says from this entire discussion, really what you can derive is as follows: if you take if your methodology of subjugating demons is to take different letters of the alphabet and put them together in incantational ways to control Shadim's behavior, that is permissible. Because what difference does it make if you're doing it to angelic forces or doing it to demonic forces? Shein hela harabi Eliezer umaisa da ashmadai domerlei shma demarach Allah. And this is what I'm not sure which Rabbi Eliezer he's referring to. But basically the story of Ashmodai in the Gemara, where Shlomo HaMelech was able to subjugate him. So that also, he used that methodology. But it could be, and that's the basis for why people today have this practice. I guess, again, 15th century, 16th century. We were talking about a long time ago where people still believed in demons. And you have to be careful that you don't do an act and you don't do an incantation, but rather you use an adjuration, which is different. I don't know the difference between an incantation and an adjuration, but it's some kind of difference in the way that you say the words. Even though this may be permissible, but it's not advisable because it's a dangerous activity. Because once you start getting involved with Shadim, they could come back to haunt you. I'm going to skip a little bit because...
Remind me when we said that, was it the Chavetz Chaim or someone who definitively said that they no longer are in our midst? Is there a time period? I'm trying to remember.
I mentioned Abaya. Abaya banished Shadim to uninhabited places. It's Gemara in Psachim.
That's a long time ago.
That's in the times of the Gemara. Yeah, but people apparently, look, there's codifications of Ruach Ra that still persists even today. So there's different levels of Shadim. That's what you have to conclude.
Okay.
So the Radbaz concludes his discussion by saying as follows. Shuv matzasi b'me'iri. I also note that the Me'iri, who is a Rishon, who a lot of his writings were lost to us for many years until we found them again in the Cairo Geniza. But he writes, Shekosov Zal, ve'elu shemaminim b'metzios hashedim u'pe'ulosehem, asur lahem lishol bahem af b'chol. He says, those who believe in the existence of demons and their behaviors, those people are not allowed to seek out those demons even during the week. V'yesh lahater v'sarei shemen v'sarei beitzim ela she'enam ela divrei havoy. He says we could permit it if we're dealing with, I'm not sure what this means with v'sarei shemen v'sarei beitzim, the shadim that are in charge of oil and over eggs, that we could let people sort of say some kind of incantation when they peel an egg or pour out oil, because I guess they believe that there were shadim in the oil and in the eggs. Ela she'enam ela divrei havoy. But the Me'iri then concludes, but it's all nonsense. Shadim is all nonsensical. The Hagirsa lefi das zu ela shemechazvin u'gedolei haposkim gorsim mipnei shemechazvin. He says there's a difference in Girsa. Why the Me'iri says it's nonsense? It could be either it because is Ela shemechazvin or mipnei shemechazvin. Klomar sheikar heter mipnei shehem divrei havai ve'ein adam matzui limashech achareim v'chein ikar ad kan lashana. He says the Me'iri basically says that they are the shadim don't really exist, and therefore a person should not get drawn after them. And this is more in accord with the Shita of the Rush. Haklal ha'olam midivarai elu she'olin the ishan o ketores ein derech lahatirim klal. The ishan o ketores ein derech lahatirim klal. So the bottom line, basically, he says, is that creating smoke or incense can never be permitted. The ha'osa ken chayav misa. And if you do so as an offering to the shadim, you're liable for the death penalty. V'hanishal ba'azhar. And if you simply seek out the demons to ask them questions after someone else has done the act, so then you've committed a biblical offense for which there is no punishment. Va'afilu shelo yedei ketores ein mutar elasari shemen v'sari beitzim v'sari bohan ayedei hashvoas shemos hakodesh. And then even without using incense or smoke, you're not allowed to, unless it's very specific kinds of demons, using holy names that are found in Sefer Yetzirah. The Yerei Shamayim yitrachek afilu mizeh. But a God-fearing person should distance himself even from those practices. Kevin shuhu machlokes bedavar sheyeh shemetz avodah zarah sheyavo limashech achareihem. Because there's the possibility that you might be drawn after them and commit an act of idolatry. And I have written what appears to me to be correct. Then he finishes off by saying, "V'lo tachshadeni mipnei shekasafti lashon hameiri sha'ani makchish metzios hashedim." He says, don't suspect that because I've quoted the Me'iri, who says that they're nonsense, that I in any way deny the existence of demons. Ki ani ma'amin b'chol divrei Chazal, afilu sicha kala shelahem. He says, because I believe in the words of Chazal, even the lightest conversation that they might have. Kol shekein shehaksuvim pshatehem morim al mitziusam. And that's certainly true because Scripture also indicates the existence of shadim. Like we saw yesterday, the pasuk in Parshat Ha'azinu, Yizbechu la shadim lo Eloah, that they offer sacrifices to shadim that do not have power. So the Ramban had said it means that they are of limited power, but they still exist. Below Yizbechu odes ivcheim lasirim, or this pasuk, they shall no longer offer their offerings to the Seirim. And we said Seirim, said the Ramban, was shadim. Okay, so bottom line is that the Radvaz believes in Shadim. He says, but he limits severely the opportunity to channel them or to do anything to control them. We have some other practices that the Rav Shulchan Aruch did not mention here, but are done because of Shadim. Here's one from the Sefer Chasidim. Lo yistom adam chalono petach legamri shelo yaziku hashedim. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but a person should not, if a person has a window in his house and he's doing renovation and he wants to seal the window, let's say he's reconfiguring, right? He wants to move the window from here to over here for whatever reason, okay? So you're not allowed to seal a window completely. Kidarkan lotses bo elayinkov bo nekav, because if shadim have a habit, they've already gotten used to the house, and they're constantly coming in and out through that one window. By you sealing that window, you're causing the shadim to get aggravated, and they're gonna haunt you. So therefore, drill a hole where the old window was, so that the shadim will still have a passageway to escape from. Okay.
How big are they, and how much room do they need?
That's a really good question. Yesh dvarim shehin kedarchei ha'amori va'afal pichein mutar. Sefer Chasidim elsewhere says that there are practices that are similar to Emorite idolatrous cultish practices, but are nevertheless permitted. Kegon adam sheshiber bayit yashin u'boneh bayit chadash ba'oto makom. Let's say you demolish an old house and you build a new one in its place. O cheder, or you demolish a portion of your house and build a new section. Yesh lahadrim babayit lizaher. Yesh lahadarim babayit lizaher shelo yishanu et hachadash min hayashan b'ptachim uv'chalonot. The people who are going to be living in the new house should be careful not to change at all the configuration of the new house from the old. You make sure that the doors and the windows of the new house are exactly like the doors and the windows of the old house. He says, because if you do change the configuration, it's a dangerous practice. That's right. That's right. So it is a very, David is on the call, by the way. David, I'm not limiting you at all as far as what you are and are not allowed to do, because we do not limit ourselves anymore in this way. There was also a practice for people to do an incantation if they would see a dangerous dog on the street. They would say that, the pasuk that says that during the plague of the firstborn, that not even a dog wagged its tongue. So people would say that. Again, he talks in this section. He also writes, "It's a sakana listom chalanos psachim lefi shema nigzar l'shedim shein lahem laver ela ba'oso haderech." He says, because if the shade was normally decreed to go through that pathway, umatriach hashedim b'makom acher, and now that you've burdened the shade to go through some other passageway, achein batilchas et regel bilam el hakir. That's why Bilam was, he says, because there was an angelic force that Dafka wanted to go in that direction, and Bilam was going against the angelic force. Okay. The Rambam and the Meiri were the ones who basically said that they were rationalists, and we know that the Vilna Gaon was critical of the of the Rambam for saying that. Okay, but did someone ask a question before we end?
Yes, Rabbi. Even Bilam mentioned something about the windows when he wants to give the course to Am Israel. He said that windows they don't look between each other, so maybe something with that related with Adam in the windows, no? Or
Was
Right.
that just about sneas?
Yeah, it was about sniut. He didn't mention windows explicitly. That's the Rashi quotes the Medrash, that he just said Matovu ohalecha Yaakov. Your tents are beautiful, but he didn't mention windows by name. Okay, so I think we're gonna basically what we've seen is that there are those who believe in demons, there are those who don't. Bottom line is, do not allow. Right, or that, and there are those who say that they don't bother us today. There are still practices that we comport ourselves with even today that are a remnant of this concern about shadim, such as not leaving water out overnight and spilling out water and things like that that was left out overnight. But as a general rule, a person should not allow his life to be governed by these kinds of superstitions. They are a minor aspect of religious practice.
Yeah, you'd think if you focus on Torah and mitzvahs, that would take care of the demons. Hashem would just protect you from